It all started on what should have been a completely ordinary Saturday morning. My wife and I had gotten up early because we wanted to beat the crowds at the community center. There was a local event happening later that day, and everyone in the neighborhood knew parking would fill up fast. So around 7 in the morning, my wife grabbed her keys, smiled at me, and said she was heading over to save us some walking later. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just someone using a parking lot exactly the way it was intended to be used. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. The moment I answered, I could hear shouting in the background. Not normal conversation, not a disagreement, full-on screaming. My wife sounded confused and frustrated. She told me a woman was standing outside her car yelling because she had parked in the first row of spaces closest to the entrance. I immediately got in my truck and headed over there. When I arrived, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was my wife sitting calmly inside her car while this HOA Karen was pacing back and forth in front of the vehicle like she was guarding a national treasure. The woman was waving her arms around, pointing at the parking space, and making a scene so large that several neighbors had already stopped to watch. As I walked up, I heard Karen shouting, "Those spots are for people who get here later. You don't take the best spot when you're the first one here." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I looked around expecting someone to explain the joke. Nobody did. Apparently, her argument was that arriving first somehow disqualified you from parking first. My wife tried explaining that the parking lot was completely empty when she arrived and that there were dozens of available spaces. Karen didn't care. She kept repeating that it was selfish to take a front row spot when no one else had arrived yet. The logic made absolutely no sense. If there were 50 empty spaces and someone parked in one of them, how exactly was that hurting anyone? But Karen wasn't interested in logic. She wanted control. The more calmly my wife responded, the angrier Karen became. Every reasonable explanation only seemed to fuel her outrage. By the time I got there, she had moved from complaining about parking etiquette to claiming my wife was violating community values. Community values. For parking legally in a parking lot. When Karen spotted me approaching, she immediately switched targets. She marched over and demanded that I tell my wife to move the car. I asked why. She said because people who arrive later deserve the closer spaces. I asked where that rule was written. She couldn't answer. I asked if the HOA had assigned parking spots. She said no. I asked if the parking lot was public community property. She said yes. I asked if my wife had parked inside the lines. She admitted she had. At that point, several neighbors were trying not to laugh. Karen realized she wasn't winning the argument, so she escalated. She claimed my wife had been disrespectful. My wife had barely spoken. Then Karen claimed she felt threatened. Nobody had threatened her. Then she claimed this was exactly why the neighborhood was declining. Again, because someone parked their car. The accusations became more ridiculous with every sentence. Meanwhile, more residents were arriving for the event, and every single one of them easily found parking because the lot was huge. The very disaster Karen had predicted simply wasn't happening. But instead of admitting she was wrong, she doubled down. She started telling everyone who arrived that my wife had stolen the best parking spot. Some people nodded politely. Others walked away shaking their heads. One elderly neighbor actually asked Karen if she had nothing better to do. That only made her angrier. She began demanding that the HOA board take immediate action. Fortunately for everyone involved, one of the board members happened to arrive right then. Karen rushed over and launched into a dramatic story about selfish behavior, parking abuse, and community disrespect. The board member listened patiently before asking one simple question. Was the car parked legally? Karen hesitated. Yes. Then what's the problem? The silence that followed was absolutely priceless. You could practically see Karen trying to invent a new argument in real time. When she couldn't come up with one, she started talking about principles. The board member wasn't interested. And my wife's car was still sitting in the exact same spot where it had been all day. Nothing bad happened. No emergencies occurred. No parking crisis emerged. The neighborhood survived the unimaginable tragedy of someone arriving first and parking first. As we drove home, my wife laughed and said she never